Hello and welcome. Well, whatever Syria's president has done, and it is plenty, it now looks like he's going nowhere. Time perhaps to reset for those who called Bashar al Assad a monster. Suddenly, he's a monster with whom it might be sensible to do business. You're watching Roundtable with me, David Foster. Bashar al Assad has hung on to power. Suddenly other countries are jockeying for position. Who stands to gain the most? And those who might be after favours, are they hypocrites or realists?
Syria's Bashar al Assad was once deemed a butcher, a war criminal, and ordered to step down by the international community. Yet after 7 years of drawn-out war nearing its end, and with the successful backing of Russia and Iran, the pariah president has turned power broker. In December last year, Sudan's accused war criminal President Omar al-Bashir was the first Arab head of state to visit Damascus since the start of the conflict. 11 days later, the UAE and Bahrain reopened their embassies in the Syrian capital. And Egypt and Algeria repeated their calls to reinstate Syria's membership to the Arab League. Assad has their support, but will Syrians and the rest of the world accept him?
Let's get talking. Joining us from Moscow, we have Alexey Khlebnikov, Middle East and North Africa expert at the Russian International Affairs Council. In Istanbul in Turkey, Syria researcher Razan Saffour. With me at the round table, we have Dr. Ian Black, author and visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics, and Nasim Ahmed, analyst at the Middle East Monitor. A warm welcome to each and every one of you. Let's start at the table. Nasim and then you, Ian. Russia aside, who has the most to gain from a rapprochement with Syria and Assad?
Well, this is quite a turnaround for Syria. I think the conflict in the region has moved into a new phase. And the battle now is to see how Syria is reintegrated into the region. A full rapprochement with Syria would see the Gulf countries, mainly Saudi Arabia, UAE, allied with Israel, making the most gains, far as in their eyes the main threat is Iran and Turkey. And they see Syria as being one of the part of the land bridge all the way from Tehran down to Lebanon. So breaking that up, bringing Syria, bringing Assad into the family of the Arab Union is a major boost. And if they can manage that and marginalize Iran, push out Turkey, that would be a massive, massive success.
Does it matter what they've said about President Assad?
From a realpolitik point of view, it doesn't really. I think that for them, they've made the decision that Assad needs to be brought into the family of the Arab Union, and this is what they're working towards. And the noises of making a full rapprochement with Assad has been coming for a number of months. You know, they've announced that the embassy will be open. There was a meeting in one of the Gulf countries during December where it was discussed between Arab representatives, Gulf representatives, as well as an Israeli intelligence officer, where they decided that Turkey needs to be pushed back, Iran needs to be pushed back, and I think that that's all part of the calculation in bringing Assad back into the Arab League and the fold of the Arabs. So since then, you've had a number of announcements from Bahrain, from UAE, saying they will open their embassies. So this is all a consequence of a realization that Assad needs to be integrated back into the Arab League and move him away from Iran as much as possible.
So is this a case, Ian, of my enemy's enemy is my friend?
Look, the fundamental point needs to be stated, I think, unequivocally. Assad has won the war. 8 years, 500,000 dead, half the population of Syria misplaced, homeless, either still within Syria or abroad. So Assad has won, and what we're seeing now is countries in the region primarily, but elsewhere, coming to terms with that and working out what they can do. Realpolitik, pragmatism, he's won. Assad's supporters were always more determined, more strategic in their view than those who supported the Syrian uprising, revolution, whatever you want to call it. Assad's victory has consequences because the region and the rest of the world has to come to terms with that. But it's not over yet, and I don't think that, for example, to take one element of what's happening at the moment, Assad's return to the Arab fold, the Arab League and so on, it doesn't mean...
Which is being backed by quite a few countries, isn't it?
It's being backed by quite a few countries,
yeah.
and I think that it will... I noticed today, for example, that Qatar, which is, of course, a bit of a special case, certainly in the Gulf, has said that it is not in a hurry to re-establish relations with Assad. The Saudis also denied it this week, but I do think that the direction of travel is quite clear, that in the Middle East, the Arab world, in order to reduce Iran's influence in Syria, will try to embrace Assad again.
I mean, given that the United Arab Emirates is pretty close to Saudi and it's reopened its embassy, would it have done that if Saudi hadn't given it a surreptitious diplomatic wink and said, go on?
I think that is a reasonable assumption. I think that, nevertheless, things are not going to happen automatically. It may take some time. The direction of travel is clear, but there are lots of questions, not least in terms of what the Americans are going to do. The man in the White House, who sets foreign policy by his incessant tweeting, is as disruptive on this subject as he has proved to be on a lot of other international issues.
I would like to come to the United States and perhaps the United Kingdom and European countries a little bit later in the programme as we sort of seek to round it off. But Alexey, let me come to you first of all. Russia is clearly the biggest winner here. In what sense do you think Russia is driving Syria's future international and regional policy?
In the first place, I wouldn't jump and rush into conclusion that Russia is a bigger winner in that situation, given the recent developments with the U.S. decision to withdraw its troops and Arab reapproachment and re-engagement with Syria. It's not a clear-cut thing. In the first place, we don't know what are the modalities and reality of the withdrawal, whether the U.S. will leave certain amount of its troops, operatives, special agents on the ground who will continue training and equip troops. And we still, as my colleague mentioned, yes, the direction is quite clear, but we don't know exactly when this replacement between Saudi Arabia and Syria would happen. Egypt, Algeria, UAE, reopening of the embassy is not does not necessarily mean a re-establishment of economic, political relations in a full scale. So it's not quite clear if Russia is a winner.
Okay, well, I mean, that has been a general assumption, but let me ask you about Russia and Iran. The suggestion at the table here was that Gulf states and other Arab states may want to make it up with President Assad because they want to see a lessening of Iranian influence in Syria. What would Russia's position be on that?
Well, it's quite a reasonable assumption, and I almost agree with it. Also, I would say that in the first place, GCC countries try to minimize their losses because they've been investing in Syria, supporting different armed groups of different degree of moderation in Syria for years. And actually, since 2015, when Russia deployed its military in Syria, they started to realize that basically their game in the country is over militarily. So currently they are looking for opportunities to minimize the costs and minimize the losses. So this is why it's an attempt to minimize their losses and kind of secure their investment in Syria, and also try to engage with Damascus, as my colleagues rightly mentioned, to keep Iranian influence in check, and also Turkey.
But you mentioned Turkey. Let's go to Razan. What is Turkey's position on this? Again, the suggestion at this table is that Gulf countries' rapprochement with Assad, if it happens, could be to lessen Turkey's influence in the region. What is Turkey's position vis-à-vis Assad? Because at one point it was helping to train opposition fighters. It took an awful lot of Syrian refugees, and it said it was willing to work with anybody who came after Assad. That's not going to happen now.
But I think that's still Turkey's case, that's still Turkey's argument at the moment. I think just last week, the foreign minister of Turkey came out and mentioned that they won't be working with Assad, though other countries will be working with Assad. I think Turkey is in a slightly difficult predicament at the moment, given that they are neighbors to Syria. They have They've suffered a lot in terms of the refugee burden upon Turkey, in terms of the PKK-PYD burden upon Turkey, and in terms of their own military involvement in the region. I think Turkey at the moment, they have remained steadfast in not necessarily working with Assad. However, they have, as we've seen, extended their hand to work with Russia in order to find a political solution for this.
On the other hand, it has been fairly equivocal. Let me quote the country's president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. "What may happen tomorrow is tied to the circumstances. Then it is not right to rule out anything on this issue." This was when he was asked if Ankara was ready to work with the Assad regime. Turkey's backing, well, he knows that Assad's going to stay, but it's in the past it said it would work with anybody but him, but it's now going to have to work with him, isn't it?
President Erdogan said, I think in 2012, that he looked forward to praying at the Umayyad Mosque in Damascus. The implication being that Assad would no longer be there. Like other countries, I mean, Turkey has played a very important role in this crisis. It's the immediate northern neighbor of it, and of course the Kurdish question, as ever, has been its main preoccupation, and we're seeing that very clearly now in the contacts between the Turks and the Americans over the next stage in the war. But clearly Erdogan, like other people, has to accept that Assad is going to stay. Turkey's position is a very important one in terms of the speed, the pace of Assad's rehabilitation. There are very important issues to be worked out, and I don't think we'll see anytime soon a return of a Turkish ambassador to Damascus. Who will go back first? The Americans, the Europeans, the Turks? I would say the Turks will probably be at the end of that queue.
Well, we'll talk about the United States and the Europeans in just a moment. Nasim, other neighbours, Jordan, let's talk about this one. Aaron Lund, who's with the Century Foundation, I like what he said. American politicians can sit in splendid isolation on the other side of the ocean and pretend Syria isn't what it is, but King Abdullah of Jordan can't. What about that neighbour and Syria and Assad?
Yeah, I mean, it can't. I mean, Jordan has a very strained history with refugees, not least Palestinian refugees, which cause a number of conflicts, civil war within in Jordan itself and Lebanon, of course. So another million refugees from Syria is probably going to push the country on the brink of a massive, tension, if not conflict.
And so Jordan was one of the 32 countries that closed its embassy.
It was.
In Damascus. Interestingly, more countries kept their embassies open. I didn't realise this until I was looking into it. More countries kept their embassies open than closed them.
Yeah.
But Jordan was one of those that closed it. So what is it going to do?
It did, but I don't think Jordan, in those sorts of issues, it makes an independent decision when it comes to who is going to open its embassy to and who it's not. So I think it's part of the Arab Gulf strings. It's part of the Arab Gulf Alliance, and which includes Cairo, which includes Saudi Arabia and Emirates, Bahrain. So I think that Jordan will go along with those countries and see where they want to take their policies. So Jordan has already opened the borders between the crossing between Syria and Jordan. So I think it will go along with those countries, but I think it needs a resolution. Primarily, its main priority is the refugees. Where will the refugees go? So whatever rapprochement you have with Assad, what's the end game? Where would the refugees end up? If there is no solution, a political solution, which allows the refugees to return to their country, which doesn't seem to be the case at the moment. At the moment, the refugees are returning in drips. We're talking about 6 million refugees. How do you accommodate 6 million, the return of 6 million refugees back to Syria? So for Jordan, that's probably much more important than a number of other issues, whether it be pushing back against Turkey and Iran. I think those issues are much of a concern to Jordan as the refugees. They want a solution to the refugees.
You're nodding at this point. What have you got to say?
No, I just completely agree that for the Syrian neighbors, it's more important to settle the most pressing issue, which is the refugees. And of course, look, which countries are aiming at restoring their embassies and relations with Turkey. with Syria, the cash-rich Gulf countries. One of their main goals is, of course, to invest economically, and by that also to create a certain limit for Iranian entrenchment in Syria. So when they started to realize that the time is ticking and basically they're losing their game in Syria, they started to decide to re-engage with Damascus and basically to lose their economic financial leverage in the country.
Razan, we've talked about the Syrian refugee crisis. That is obviously uppermost in an awful lot of people's mind. But what about the economic opportunities for people inside Syria? Will every country that surrounds it be looking to take advantage of any kind of peace that comes, even if Assad remains in power?
Well, I can't say for sure, but I do definitely think that Syria, as mentioned before, is going to become an economic battleground. Everyone is going to want to invest in Syria, especially since Syria at the moment, or as Assad remains, will not have strong leadership. Assad essentially, though it's been argued that he's won the war, I disagree. I'd say that he's won the battle. He hasn't actually won the war yet. He is effectively a puppet. And so he will be accepting any investments coming in from any side. We've seen even Lebanon, which within itself is in its own ruins, is thinking of investing in Syria. So I think definitely, but I do want to make a quick point, which I don't think has been brought up at the moment. We've been speaking about all these actors, but I think the most important actor has been completely muted out of this discussion. That is this actual Syrian people. What do the Syrian people think about this, and whether they themselves are accepting this narrative on Syria rebuilding and reconstruction, where they themselves, I mean, we've spoken about the refugees, but are the refugees actually going to go back to Syria? I highly doubt it. You have people right now freezing in the Rokaban camp on the borders of Jordan, and it's been proposed to them to go to Syria, and they've refused, despite them dying. We've had, I think, at least 40 people who've died in the last month.
But when you say, and I'm sorry to override you here, it's terrible, and we have been reporting on those conditions, but when you said they need to have a say, well, they had no say in the fact that they were involved in the conflict in the first place. Who's going to give them any kind of say?
I think this is when the international community has to actually involve the Syrians. I mean, you have millions of Syrians out there. You have the political opposition, which has been lamed out essentially by the international community themselves. And they haven't been given the right, or they haven't been given justice, essentially. Sure, okay, we've had the Geneva process, and the Geneva process hasn't necessarily been very successful, but there hasn't, I mean, I don't feel like the Syrian oppositions themselves have had the right for representation. They haven't had that space to represent themselves. The Syrian people themselves, whether in the media, whether when they speak, they're completely muted out, as if they weren't the people who started this revolution, as if they weren't the people who are essentially, when we speak about the war, who is the war against? It's between this Syrian regime and the Syrian people.
Razan, with all due respect, I mean, we've talked about the humanitarian situation there many, many times. I'm trying to work out which outside players are trying to take advantage. And you referred to Assad as a puppet. I wonder if you meant he was a Russian puppet. And Alexey, what do you make of that?
I don't think it's quite acceptable to call it this way. I don't think that in the first place, Russia have much leverage and influence on Damascus as well as on Iran. And it's quite a miscalculation or exaggeration if we call it this way. Certainly, Russia has some leverage, but it doesn't control Damascus. And previously, over the last years, since the deployment of Russian military on the ground in Syria, Russia faced a lot of difficulties with dealing with Damascus. In fact, we witnessed a lot of provocations from Damascus side when Russia strikes its fires and deals. So on Damascus and Tehran side.
Right, but let me ask you this: Are Russian companies already involved in trying to rebuild certain areas of Syria? Are they making economic mileage out of what's been going on?
So far, there are several agreements struck by Russian companies and Syrian government in terms of exploration of shale gas oil fields off Syrian shore. Also, there's certain contracts on reconstruction of factories, production of chemical and petroleum industry.
Russia, the big beneficiary of this? I said apart from Russia at the beginning, who's the winner? We disputed that, etc., but Russian companies already in there.
Russian companies already in there. Russia wants to continue its military support for, not Assad in particular, but Syria. It wants to stabilize Syria. So that's, as long as it has a stabilized Syria, I think Russia is happy. But I think there is the direction of travel seems to me to be quite short-sighted at the moment, because Assad is in a very fortunate position in the sense that there are Gulf countries, you have Iran and Russia vying to keep Assad and Syria in their orbit of influence. So it can attract a lot of money, a lot of investment from those countries. And many of these countries will pour money into Syria as an extension of their peace treaty. But if that does not happen with the refugees and the 6 million Syrians who are expelled, then I think in the long term, what this will do is destabilize Turkey, it will destabilize Lebanon, it will destabilize Jordan. So all these countries are exposed to threats, tensions, and Assad will have backing from a lot of the Gulf countries. So that's a perspective which is not going to be.
Ian, you've been making notes the whole time.
Well, you say a peace treaty. There's no peace.
I don't mean a peace treaty.
And I think actually responding to what Razan said, big picture, Assad has won, but the war is not over yet. It really is. We've been talking for quite a while. We haven't even mentioned Idlib province in the northwest, which is facing a very, very uncertain and possibly bloody future.
Ian, there are so many strands to this, and we can't go into.
No.
So what
I'm not complaining.
What I'm aiming at in this program is to
course,
try and find out who's going to win, who's going to lose economically and with influence.
We're seeing now the beginnings of the end. It's not quite clear yet how it's going to end, except I think it is fairly certain that Assad is going to remain, and in the big picture, he has won. But there's quite a lot of significant detail to be worked out. What happens between the Turks and the Americans, for example, in the north? What happens to Idlib province? Will the Saudis actually follow their smaller neighbours, and so on and so forth?
What about the European Union, which got sanctions on it? Do bear with me for just a second. When is that going to come in and say, listen, if we don't start taking advantage of this opportunity, we're going to be at the back of the queue? What about the United States?
Well, Europe, goodness, let's not start talking about Brexit. Europe's got its own problems.
No, let's not.
Let's not. But Europe has its own problems. Brexit is an enormous diversion. Germany has how many hundreds of thousands of Syrian refugees who clearly it would like to have at least the opportunity.
But there will be those saying, if we wait too long, we'll miss an opportunity.
There will be those saying that. I think that it's not going to happen very soon. I think that the more significant player is as ever the Americans, because they have forces on the ground. The British and the French have very small numbers of forces on the ground as well. And interestingly, when President Trump made his extraordinary announcement just the other week that he was pulling out American forces, he was contradicted publicly by the British and French governments. Hang on, ISIS has not yet been defeated.
But he's a businessman too. One day he's going to turn around, if he's still in power, and say, look, we need to get in there.
And I think that will happen. I think that will happen, and I think it'll happen eventually with everybody. The reason I say that the war isn't completely over yet is that I think we're just getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, that's all.
But once the rapprochement with the Arab neighbours is complete, I think
So that happens first.
That happens first, and then once that's done, I think the Europeans will move in, the Americans, of course, will go in as well.
The British government just the other day put out a statement. I can't remember what it was prompted by, but it was against the background of this reopening of embassies.
Yeah.
And it said very explicitly it would not be doing that.
We have no plans is often the phrase. Will it be seen as hypocrisy, or will it be framed in the case of, look, we want to help the Syrian people? Which one is right?
Well, politics is often littered with hypocrisy, and I don't think it's in the public side. This will definitely be seen as another case of great hypocrisy with making alliances once again with someone who probably would be classified as a war criminal if there was an ICC investigation into Assad and many of his generals. There would be a strong case to put him in prison. And so the narrative for human rights is not great. We once again see the overturning of a revolution for human rights and democracy in the region. And this would have been seen as a complete the end of the cycle, where the Arab Spring has been pushed back and the victors are the autocrats. They've been reinstated and the West has completed its the revolution against the democratic forces has been completed. So this is not a good narrative for the people on the streets. It's not a good narrative for them.
And we didn't even bring Lebanon into it very much, other than the fact we talked about the Arab League. There's a meeting of an Arab League economic group coming up fairly soon, and the suggestion was that perhaps Syria should be invited to it. The feeling I get is that we have to wait and see exactly what Arab countries do if they invite Syria back into the Arab League, however ineffective the Arab League might be. Then we're seeing pretty much a turning point. Alexey, thank you very much indeed. And Razan too, thank you very much from Istanbul. Good to see you on our screens. And thank you, Ian, thank you, Nasim, thank you very much indeed. Thank you for watching. We hope to have your company on another occasion here at Roundtable. For now, from me, David Foster, and the team, goodbye.